Spokane, Washington, March 14, 2011. The evening air carried a sharp chill as winter reluctantly yielded to spring in the Pacific Northwest. The Washington State University satellite campus buzzed with students preparing for midterm exams, the library staying open until midnight to accommodate the studious crowd. At 10:37 p.m., security cameras captured 19-year-old Tessa Bellamy walking across the nearly empty campus parking lot. A psychology and criminology double major with a promising future, Tessa had just finished her shift at the university library. The footage showed her walking with purpose, keys already in hand, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore a gray university hoodie, jeans, and carried a messenger bag heavy with textbooks. The security footage, later scrutinized frame by investigators, revealed a critical moment. As Tessa approached her 2008 Honda Civic, a figure emerged from between two parked vehicles. The camera angle obscured his face, but it captured enough to show a man of average height wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap. For 12 seconds, the two appeared to engage in conversation. Then, abruptly, Tessa's body language changed. She took a step back. The man moved forward. The footage ended with both individuals moving out of frame. When campus security conducted their routine patrol of the parking lot at 11:15 p.m., they discovered Tessa's car with the driver's door ajar, interior light casting a glow across the empty seat. Her messenger bag lay on the passenger side, contents undisturbed. Her keys were found on the asphalt 3 feet from the vehicle. Tessa Bellamy had vanished. Detective Lowell Shepard of the Spokane Police Department received the call at 11:42 p.m. A 20-year veteran with the department's violent crimes unit, Shepard had investigated 17 abduction cases throughout his career. He would later tell reporters that the Bellamy case stood out from the beginning. "Time is the enemy in these situations," Shepard explained. "The first 48 hours are critical. After that, the odds shift dramatically against us." The Bellamy family was notified shortly after midnight. Diana Bellamy, a clinical psychologist, and her husband Nathan, an environmental engineer, arrived at the police station at 1:23 a.m. Their composed exterior belied their growing terror as they provided photographs of their daughter and answered Detective Shepard's questions about Tessa's habits, relationships, and recent behavior. "She's methodical," Diana told investigators. "She texts when she's running late, always, even 5 minutes. It's just who she is." The first 24 hours of the investigation unfolded with clinical precision. Campus police secured the scene and collected evidence from Tessa's vehicle. Security footage was gathered from the library, parking lot, and surrounding buildings. Tessa's cell phone records were obtained through an emergency court order. Her phone had last pinged a tower near the university at 10:39 p.m., consistent with the time of her disappearance. After that, the device went dark, either turned off or destroyed. By dawn, search teams assembled. Volunteers from the university joined law enforcement to comb the wooded areas surrounding the campus. Flyers with Tessa's photograph appeared across Spokane. Local news stations interrupted regular programming with the developing story of the missing student. Diana and Nathan Bellamy faced the cameras with remarkable composure, a trait that would later be scrutinized by online conspiracy theorists who found their calm demeanor suspicious. In reality, Diana's professional background had equipped her with crisis management skills that allowed her to function despite overwhelming fear. "Tessa is intelligent and resourceful," Diana told reporters. "Whoever has her has made a grave mistake in judgment." The investigation's first significant lead emerged on the morning of March 16th, when a witness came forward. Eliza Morton, a graduate student, reported seeing Tessa speaking with a man in the library around 9:30 p.m. on the night of the disappearance. Morton described him as intense-looking with light brown hair, approximately in his 30s, wearing a dark jacket. He had been sitting near Tessa's desk area for at least an hour before approaching her. "He wasn't a student," Morton told Detective Shepard. "He seemed out of place, too old to be an undergraduate, but not dressed like faculty." Library records confirmed that a guest pass had been issued to a Daniel Mitchell at 8:15 p.m. that evening. The address and ID provided were later determined to be fraudulent. Meanwhile, the forensic team processing Tessa's vehicle discovered 2 partial fingerprints on the exterior door handle that didn't match Tessa or any of her known associates. When run through AFIS, Automated Fingerprint Identification System, they yielded no matches, indicating the perpetrator had no prior arrests. On March 17th, 3 days after Tessa's disappearance, the investigation took a darker turn. A campus custodian found Tessa's cell phone in a trash can near the engineering building, a quarter-mile from where her car had been parked. The device had been wiped clean of fingerprints. Forensic analysts were able to recover deleted text messages, revealing that Tessa had received several messages from an unknown number in the weeks before her disappearance. The messages started innocuously. "You made some interesting points in Dr. Halford's criminology lecture today. That psychology journal you were reading in the coffee shop looks fascinating." The texts progressed to more personal observations. "The blue sweater you wore today really brings out your eyes. You seem tired lately. Working too hard?" Tessa had responded to the earliest messages, assuming they were from a classmate, but had stopped replying and eventually blocked the number when the communications became increasingly personal. The sender had simply switched to a new number. This digital trail painted a disturbing picture. Someone had been watching Tessa closely, studying her movements and routines. The investigation shifted from a possible random abduction to a targeted stalking scenario. Detective Shepard assembled a task force, bringing in specialists from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. They constructed a preliminary profile of the suspect. Male, likely between 30-40 years old, socially functional, but with difficulty forming meaningful relationships. The precision of the abduction suggested planning and patience, hallmarks of a dangerous predator. 6 days into the investigation, surveillance footage from a gas station 5 miles north of campus captured a dark van with partially obscured license plates at 11:04 p.m. on the night of Tessa's disappearance. The timing aligned with the abduction window. The driver, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses despite the late hour, never faced the camera directly. Enhanced footage revealed a partial license plate, WXY72R. Washington DMV records identified 43 vans matching the partial plate within a 100-mile radius of Spokane. Detectives began the painstaking process of checking each one. On the 7th day, as media attention began to wane and the Bellamy family struggled against growing despair, a breakthrough emerged from an unexpected direction. A regional property manager reviewing security camera footage from a residential complex reported a dark van with matching partial plates entering the underground parking garage at River's Edge Apartments at 11:52 p.m. on March 14th. The driver had used a key card registered to a tenant named Darian Mercer. Darian Mercer, 32, had no criminal record. His employment history showed he'd worked as a security guard at the Northtown Mall until 4 months prior, when he was terminated for policy violations. Human Resources refused to elaborate without a court order. A cursory background check revealed few red flags. Mercer had attended Washington State for 2 semesters 6 years earlier, before dropping out. His credit report showed moderate debt, but regular payments. Neighbors described him as quiet and keeps to himself, the standard, unhelpful descriptors that follow so many who later make headlines. Detective Shepard obtained a search warrant for Mercer's apartment and vehicle, but elected to conduct surveillance before moving in. For 24 hours, unmarked police vehicles monitored the apartment complex, watching for any sign of Tessa or unusual activity. Mercer followed a routine schedule, leaving for work at a warehouse at 7:15 a.m. and returning at 6:30 p.m. He left once in the evening to shop for groceries. Nothing in his behavior suggested he was holding a captive. What the surveillance team couldn't know was that Tessa Bellamy wasn't being held in Mercer's apartment at all. The truth was far more isolated, more calculated, and would reveal just how extensively Mercer had planned his crime. On March 23rd, 9 days after Tessa's disappearance, police executed the search warrant on Mercer's apartment. What they discovered inside shifted the investigation dramatically and confirmed their worst fears about Tessa's situation. The evidence they uncovered would not only reveal Mercer's obsession, but would also provide the first glimmer of hope that Tessa might still be alive, and somewhere no one had yet thought to look. As Detective Shepard stepped into Mercer's meticulously organized apartment, he immediately recognized the signs of a predator who had been hiding in plain sight. The true nature of Darian Mercer was about to be revealed, along with the disturbing extent of his fixation on Tessa Bellamy. But what investigators couldn't yet know was how Tessa herself was already analyzing her captor, drawing on unexpected knowledge that would eventually become her salvation. The search of Darian Mercer's apartment revealed a disturbing duality. On the surface, it was unremarkable: furniture from discount retailers, a modest television, kitchen cabinets stocked with processed foods. But behind this veneer of normalcy, Detective Shepard and his team discovered a hidden dimension to Mercer's life that sent a chill through even the most seasoned investigators. The spare bedroom had been converted into what Shepard would later describe in his report as a surveillance command center. A corkboard covered the entire east wall, meticulously organized with photographs of Tessa Bellamy. The images chronicled months of her life. Tessa walking to class, studying in the library, having coffee with friends, unlocking her apartment door. Some were taken with a telephoto lens from a distance, others from much closer proximity. He'd been watching her for at least 4 months, forensic analyst Kira Mitchell noted. The earliest photos date back to November 2010. Beneath the photos, Mercer had created a detailed timeline of Tessa's routine. Her class schedule was documented with precision, including her preferred routes across campus. Notes recorded her regular coffee order, the grocery store where she shopped, and the days she typically did laundry. Even more disturbing were logs of her social interactions, who she spent time with, how long and with what frequency. A small desk beneath the board held a laptop computer. Digital forensics would later recover deleted searches about Tessa, including her social media profiles, academic achievements, and family background. Mercer had researched Diana Bellamy's psychology practice, even downloading scholarly articles she had published. This wasn't random. This wasn't opportunistic, FBI behavioral analyst Renee Palmer explained. This was targeted and obsessive. He selected her specifically and spent months learning everything about her before making his move. The investigation into Mercer's background accelerated. Former co-workers at Northtown Mall were interviewed, revealing the true reason for his termination. 3 female employees had reported uncomfortable interactions with Mercer, describing him as intensely focused on them. Security camera footage had shown him following one young woman through the mall during his off hours. When confronted by management, Mercer had insisted he was just being friendly. He was terminated without formal charges being filed. Looking back, we should have done more, his former supervisor admitted. But he never explicitly threatened anyone. He was just off, unsettling. Mercer's employment history showed a pattern of security positions: mall security, overnight watchman at a storage facility, briefly as a campus security contractor at a community college in Oregon. These roles had given him access to surveillance equipment and techniques, which he had evidently applied to stalking Tessa. The investigation yielded another crucial discovery when detectives uncovered a hidden compartment in Mercer's closet containing a lockbox. Inside were driver's licenses with Mercer's photo, but different names, including the Daniel Mitchell identity he had used at the university library. Also in the box, a collection of small personal items that didn't belong to him: a woman's hair elastic, a coffee shop receipt, a university bookstore pencil. Trophies, Palmer explained. Items connected to women he'd observed or followed before. Tessa wasn't his first fixation, but she appears to be the first he escalated to abduction. Most significantly, investigators found a receipt for a remote cabin rental in the Cascade Mountains, paid in cash 3 months earlier. The rental agreement was under the name Mitchell and extended for 6 months. While the search continued, Mercer returned to his apartment. Surveillance officers intercepted him in the parking garage. When informed of the search warrant, Mercer's response was unnervingly calm. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I've never heard of Tessa Bellamy." His composure cracked only when Detective Shepard mentioned the cabin. A flicker of alarm crossed his face before he reasserted control and requested a lawyer. Mercer's van was impounded and processed. Forensic technicians found trace evidence: a single strand of hair matching Tessa's DNA profile in the cargo area. The vehicle had been meticulously cleaned, but luminol testing revealed blood residue consistent with a minor injury, likely from subduing Tessa during the abduction. The GPS history on the van's navigation system had been cleared, but tech specialists recovered fragments showing a route into the Cascade Mountains on the night of the abduction. The coordinates aligned with the cabin location from the rental receipt. As a tactical team prepared to approach the mountain cabin, Diana Bellamy requested a meeting with Detective Shepard. She arrived carrying a stack of DVDs and a notebook. "Tessa has been studying true crime since she was 16, Diana explained. "Not just casually watching documentaries, she analyzes them. It started when I was consulting on a criminal psychology case. She became fascinated with survivor psychology." Diana showed Shepard the notebook, Tessa's detailed analysis of abduction cases, with particular focus on those where victims had survived through psychological tactics. "She's not just a victim," Diana said, her voice steady despite her evident fear. "She understands predatory psychology. If anyone could find a way to survive this, it's Tessa." Shepard regarded the notebook thoughtfully. "Mrs. Bellamy, are you suggesting your daughter might be capable of manipulating her captor?" "I'm saying my daughter has spent years studying exactly this scenario. She knows that direct resistance often escalates violence. She knows about establishing rapport, creating dependency, exploiting psychological weaknesses." Diana's professional demeanor briefly cracked. She's been preparing for this without knowing it. The tactical team reached the cabin access road at dawn on March 24th, 10 days after Tessa's disappearance. The location was strategically isolated, 5 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a narrow dirt track winding through dense forest. No neighboring properties within sight or sound. The perfect location to hold someone against their will. Using thermal imaging, officers confirmed 2 heat signatures inside the structure, one stationary on what appeared to be a bed, another moving through the cabin. Following protocol for hostage situations, they established a perimeter and brought in crisis negotiators. Inside the cabin, unaware of the approaching rescue, Tessa Bellamy was already implementing her own strategy for survival, one based on psychological principles she had studied in films and documentaries about real-life abductions. She had recognized the particular danger posed by her captor. Darian Mercer didn't want just any victim. He wanted her specifically. His obsession had built over months of watching her, constructing an idealized version of her in his mind. And Tessa, drawing on her knowledge of criminal psychology, had begun a dangerous psychological game, pretending to develop an emotional connection with her captor while secretly looking for any opportunity to escape. She was employing techniques she had analyzed in case studies of Stockholm Syndrome, but with a crucial difference. Her apparent psychological dependence was a calculated act. As dawn broke over the mountain cabin and law enforcement closed in, neither Tessa nor Mercer yet realized that their isolated psychological battlefield was about to be breached. But the coming confrontation would not unfold as anyone expected. Not the tactical team, not Detective Shepard, and certainly not Darian Mercer. Because in the 10 days of her captivity, Tessa Bellamy had been studying her captor with the same methodical attention to detail that he had once devoted to stalking her. The rescue operation was about to encounter something unexpected, a victim who had already set her own liberation in motion through psychological warfare that would soon culminate in either her freedom or a potentially deadly confrontation. The isolation of the cabin in the Cascade Mountains had been Darian Mercer's primary consideration when selecting a location to hold Tessa. Positioned on the eastern slope of the range, the small structure sat on 3 acres of densely wooded land. The nearest neighbor was over 5 miles away, and cell phone reception was non-existent. During winter months, the access road often became impassable, though by mid-March the snow had receded enough to allow careful navigation by 4-wheel drive. The cabin itself was primitive but functional, a main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and 2 bedrooms. The windows had been reinforced with steel security bars installed by Mercer months before the abduction. The front door featured 3 separate locks, and the back door had been permanently sealed. Mercer had meticulously planned every detail of the confinement, including the installation of a generator for electricity and the stockpiling of non-perishable food items. For Tessa Bellamy, the first 72 hours of captivity had been the most dangerous. Mercer's behavior fluctuated between periods of bizarre courtesy and flashes of threatening anger, when reality failed to match his fantasized expectations of their relationship. The initial phase of captivity is statistically the most volatile, FBI analyst Palmer would later explain. The perpetrator is adjusting to the reality versus the fantasy they've constructed. When the victim doesn't behave according to script, violence often results. What Mercer couldn't have anticipated was Tessa's remarkable psychological awareness. Through her studies of criminal psychology and victim accounts, she recognized the precarious nature of her situation. Rather than displaying outright defiance, she made a calculated decision to appear subdued and compliant, conserving her energy and observing her captor's patterns. The room where Tessa was confined had been prepared specifically for her arrival. The walls were painted a pale blue, the same shade as her apartment bedroom, a detail Mercer had gleaned during his surveillance. A bookshelf held titles similar to those on her university reading lists. The bed had been made with fresh linens, and the room was kept scrupulously clean. These attempts at creating a comfortable environment revealed the depth of Mercer's delusion. He had constructed an elaborate fantasy in which Tessa would eventually recognize his devotion and reciprocate his feelings. This delusion proved to be both a danger and potentially Tessa's greatest advantage. On the fourth day of captivity, Tessa began implementing a subtle psychological strategy. Drawing on case studies she had analyzed, she engaged Mercer in limited conversation, asking him questions about himself, not to build genuine rapport, but to gather information that might aid her escape. She was conducting her own criminal profile, Diana Bellamy would later observe, using every interaction to assess his vulnerabilities. Tessa discovered that Mercer visited the cabin daily, but left for several hours each afternoon to work at a warehouse in a nearby town. He maintained his job to avoid arousing suspicion, driving the 40 minutes each way. During these absences, Tessa systematically tested the security of her confinement, examining window bars, lock mechanisms, and potential improvised tools. Meanwhile, as the investigation intensified, the Bellamy case began to lose prominence in media coverage. A political scandal and a natural disaster overseas pushed Tessa's story from headlines to brief mentions. The shifting public attention worried Diana and Nathan, who feared the diminishing coverage would reduce pressure on law enforcement. Detective Shepard, however, had no intention of scaling back resources. "We don't work based on news cycles," he told the Bellamys. "We work until we bring your daughter home." The task force maintained round-the-clock operations, systematically investigating each element of Mercer's life. They interviewed former neighbors, classmates from his brief college attendance, and even distant relatives. A pattern emerged of a man who had always existed on the periphery, present but never truly connected, observing rather than participating. His former therapist, bound by confidentiality but cooperating within legal parameters, described Mercer as having significant attachment issues and difficulty distinguishing between healthy interest and obsessive fixation. He had discontinued therapy after 3 sessions, when the therapist suggested these issues required deeper exploration. As the investigation methodically built a profile of Mercer, Tessa was conducting her own analysis within the cabin. By the end of the first week, she had identified crucial aspects of his psychology that she could potentially exploit. Mercer craved validation and recognition. His interactions with Tessa frequently included references to how much he understood her. Unlike others in her life, he spoke disparagingly about her friends and even her parents, attempting to position himself as the only person who truly appreciated her intelligence and potential. This need for affirmation became Tessa's tactical opening. She began subtly reinforcing his self-perception as insightful and misunderstood. Not overtly, any sudden change in her behavior would trigger suspicion, but gradually, allowing him to believe he was winning her over. "I thought about what you said yesterday," she told him on the 8th day, carefully maintaining a neutral tone. "About how people don't really see each other. I've felt that way sometimes." These calculated moments of apparent connection fueled Mercer's delusion while giving Tessa incremental freedoms. He began leaving her door unlocked when he was in the cabin. He allowed her to prepare meals in the kitchen under his supervision. Each small liberty was mentally catalogued by Tessa as a potential avenue for escape. Simultaneously, she maintained an awareness of the psychological danger she faced. The longer she remained in captivity, the greater the risk of actual trauma bonding. The line between feigned attachment and genuine dependency could blur under prolonged stress and isolation. The human mind seeks connection even in the most hostile environments, Diana had written in one of her published papers on captivity psychology. The challenge for survivors is maintaining internal psychological sovereignty while externally appearing to acquiesce. Tessa applied this principle rigorously, creating mental rituals to reinforce her true identity and purpose. Each night, she silently recited her full name, her home address, and the names of her parents and friends. She mentally reviewed her academic goals and plans for the future. These private affirmations served as an internal anchor against the psychological current pulling her toward genuine Stockholm Syndrome. By the 10th day of captivity, the day law enforcement discovered the cabin, Tessa had established what appeared to be a cooperative relationship with Mercer. He had begun sharing more personal information, including details about his work schedule and his interactions with others. Most significantly, he had revealed that he needed specific medication for a chronic condition. This information became the foundation for Tessa's developing escape strategy. She carefully noted his medication schedule and the apparent symptoms when he delayed taking it. She observed which keys opened which locks, how he secured the cabin when leaving, and the route he took down the mountain. What neither Tessa nor Mercer knew as the tactical team established their perimeter around the cabin was that their isolated psychological battlefield was about to be breached. But the confrontation would not unfold as anyone anticipated. The rescue operation about to be launched would intersect with Tessa's own carefully developed strategy in unexpected ways. As dawn broke over the mountain cabin, and officers prepared for a potential hostage situation, they were operating under standard protocols for such scenarios, assuming a traumatized victim and a volatile captor. What they couldn't know was that inside the cabin, Tessa Bellamy was not merely waiting to be rescued. She was actively orchestrating her own liberation through psychological techniques gleaned from years of studying similar cases. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only law enforcement tactics, but also Tessa's extraordinary psychological resilience, a quality that would soon prove to be her most powerful weapon against the man who had so meticulously planned her captivity. The tactical team surrounding the cabin faced a classic hostage dilemma. Standard protocol called for establishing communication with the suspect, attempting negotiation, and using force only as a last resort. However, any approach risked alerting Mercer and potentially triggering violence toward his captive. Special Agent Dominic Rivera, the FBI tactical commander on scene, opted for surveillance before engagement. "We need to understand the dynamics inside before we make contact," he told Detective Shepard. Pattern of life, routines, vulnerabilities. Unaware of the law enforcement presence, Tessa Bellamy was implementing the next phase of her psychological strategy. By day 10 of her captivity, she had compiled critical observations about her captor. Mercer suffered from what appeared to be an anxiety disorder, controlled with medication he took twice daily. When doses were missed, his behavior became more erratic, alternating between agitation and lethargy. He was obsessively careful about security when leaving for work, but had begun growing complacent during his time in the cabin, particularly when Tessa reinforced his fantasy of their developing relationship. Most importantly, Tessa had identified Mercer's fundamental psychological vulnerability. His entire identity was built around the narrative that he alone truly understood and appreciated her. This delusion required her eventual validation to be complete. Unlike many captors who primarily sought control, Mercer craved recognition. He wanted Tessa to acknowledge the special connection he believed existed between them. This insight became the cornerstone of her strategy. In retrospect, what Tessa did was extraordinary. Dr. Eleanor Reeves, a trauma psychologist who later analyzed the case, would explain. She essentially created a controlled version of Stockholm Syndrome, mimicking attachment while maintaining her psychological independence. It's a technique that hostage negotiators train for years to master. On the morning of March 24th, as law enforcement surveilled the cabin, Tessa initiated a carefully calibrated conversation with Mercer. She had been gradually increasing her apparent openness with him, strategically revealing personal information that aligned with his fantasy. "I've been thinking about what you said about feeling invisible to others," she told him, maintaining the delicate balance between engagement and obvious manipulation. "Before all this, I sometimes felt that way at the university. Just another student ID number." This approach validated Mercer's worldview, while positioning Tessa as someone capable of understanding his perceived isolation. She wasn't simply acquiescing to captivity, she was strategically feeding his need for recognition while subtly shifting the power dynamic. The tactical team observing the cabin noted regular patterns. Mercer left each day around noon, returning approximately 5 hours later. During his absence, they observed Tessa moving within the cabin but making no attempts to escape, behavior that initially confused investigators. "Why wouldn't she try to break out when he's gone?" an officer asked Rivera. "Because she's smart," Rivera replied. "The windows are barred, doors are secured. A failed escape attempt would only escalate the situation." What they couldn't know was that Tessa had already assessed and rejected direct escape attempts. The security measures Mercer had installed were indeed formidable. Moreover, the cabin's isolation meant that even if she broke free, she would face miles of wilderness without supplies or communication. Her strategy required not just escaping the cabin, but ensuring Mercer couldn't recapture her. On day 11, Tessa implemented the next phase of her plan. During breakfast, she deliberately mentioned feeling unwell, specifically describing symptoms that mirrored Mercer's anxiety condition. This was not a random complaint, but a calculated move to create commonality. "Sometimes my thoughts race too, like you described," she told him. "Back home, I use techniques from my mother's psychology practice to manage it." This reference to shared experience, combined with the mention of management techniques, planted a crucial seed. Mercer, who viewed his medication as a necessary weakness, immediately engaged. "What kind of techniques?" he asked. Over the next 2 days, Tessa gradually introduced basic mindfulness exercises, teaching Mercer breathing patterns and grounding techniques. These legitimate psychological tools served a dual purpose. They established Tessa as a source of help rather than just a victim, and they gave her opportunities to observe how susceptible Mercer was to suggestion. She was essentially conducting a real-time assessment of his psychological malleability, Dr. Reeves noted, testing how far she could guide his behavior before triggering suspicion. The surveillance team documented these interactions through thermal imaging and long-range microphones, though much of the audio was fragmentary. They observed what appeared to be increasingly cooperative behavior between captor and captive, a development that concerned some team members. "Is she actually bonding with him?" one agent questioned. Detective Shepard, who had reviewed Diana Bellamy's insights about her daughter's psychological knowledge, had a different interpretation. "I think she's playing him," he told Rivera. "She's buying time and building trust." On the morning of day 13, the team observed a significant change in routine. Mercer appeared agitated, checking his watch repeatedly and making several phone calls. Through audio surveillance, they determined he was low on his medication and needed to refill his prescription. Inside the cabin, Tessa recognized the opportunity this presented. When Mercer mentioned his need to drive to the pharmacy in the nearby town, she implemented the most dangerous aspect of her strategy. "You seem really anxious about missing your medication," she observed carefully. "I understand. I get anxious too when I'm low on my birth control. Maybe I could go with you. It might be good for me to get out of the cabin for a bit." The request was precisely calibrated, acknowledging his need while framing her accompaniment as beneficial to them both. The mention of birth control was particularly strategic, subtly reinforcing the possibility of physical intimacy that existed in Mercer's fantasy. The surveillance team observed an extended conversation, Mercer initially rejecting the idea before gradually warming to it. His eventual agreement represented the culmination of Tessa's psychological manipulation. She had successfully convinced her captor to voluntarily bring her into public space. "She's getting him to take her out," Shepard realized. "She's creating her own rescue opportunity." Rivera immediately adjusted the tactical plan. Rather than raiding the cabin, they would track Mercer's vehicle and intercept it in a more controlled environment, ideally the pharmacy parking lot, where additional agents could be pre-positioned. As Mercer and Tessa prepared to leave the cabin, the team observed something remarkable. Tessa maintained her supportive demeanor while subtly influencing practical decisions, suggesting she wear one of her original outfits to avoid attention rather than the clothes Mercer had provided, proposing they create a cover story as a couple rather than trying to keep her hidden. "She's not just escaping," Rivera commented. "She's managing his behavior to minimize risk. I've seen trained negotiators with less skill." The surveillance team tracked them to Mercer's van, noting that while he kept Tessa close, he no longer bound her hands or employed obvious restraints. The psychological restraints he believed he had established had replaced physical ones, exactly as Tessa had intended. As the van departed down the mountain road, the tactical team mobilized. Advance units moved to the pharmacy in the town below, while others followed at a distance. The operation had transformed from a cabin raid to a mobile interdiction, all because of Tessa Bellamy's extraordinary psychological strategy. What no one, not the tactical team, not Detective Shepard, and certainly not Darian Mercer, could anticipate was that Tessa's plan extended beyond simply being seen in public. During her captivity, she had methodically studied not only Mercer's psychology, but also his patterns, weaknesses, and the details of the world he had constructed. She was not simply waiting for rescue. She had developed a multi-layered strategy that would soon culminate in a confrontation where her greatest weapons would be her mind and her remarkable capacity for controlled manipulation. As the van wound down the mountain road toward town, Tessa Bellamy prepared for the most dangerous performance of her life, one where a single misstep could be fatal, but success would mean freedom. The psychological battlefield was shifting from the isolation of the cabin to the public space of the pharmacy, where Tessa intended to finally reclaim control from the man who had stolen her life 13 days earlier. The Mountain View Pharmacy in the small town of Elkridge sat in a modest strip mall, its large windows offering clear sightlines from the parking lot to the interior. By 2:15 p.m. on March 27, 2011, FBI agents in plainclothes had established positions throughout the area, 2 posing as customers inside the pharmacy, 3 in vehicles in the parking lot, and others securing the perimeter. Detective Shepard, monitoring from an unmarked car, received updates as Mercer's van approached town. "Target vehicle entering Elkridge city limits," came the report. ETA to pharmacy approximately 7 minutes. Inside the van, Tessa maintained her calculated demeanor of cooperative anxiety, a delicate balance that Mercer found reassuring. She had spent the 40-minute drive from the cabin, reinforcing his delusion that this excursion represented progress in their relationship, a sign of growing trust. "Remember our story if anyone asks," Mercer instructed as they neared town. "You're my girlfriend visiting from Seattle." "I understand," Tessa replied, her tone measured. "We're just getting your prescription. Nothing complicated." This apparent simplicity masked the sophisticated psychological architecture of Tessa's plan. Throughout her captivity, she had been constructing what psychologists would later term a managed delusion, allowing Mercer to believe his fantasy was gradually becoming reality, while systematically exploiting the vulnerabilities this delusion created. The van pulled into the pharmacy parking lot at 2:23 p.m. Surveillance teams observed Mercer scanning the area before turning to Tessa. Audio surveillance captured fragments of his instructions. "Stay close. Don't draw attention. 5 minutes only." What followed demonstrated the remarkable psychological discipline Tessa had maintained through 13 days of captivity. As they exited the vehicle, she stayed within arm's reach of Mercer, her body language suggesting appropriate caution, but not obvious fear. She had dressed in her own clothes, jeans and a grey university hoodie, but had deliberately mussed her hair and avoided eye contact with others, presenting an appearance that wouldn't immediately trigger concern. She understood that an abrupt escape attempt could escalate to violence, FBI behavioral analyst Palmer would later explain. Instead, she created conditions where Mercer would voluntarily lower his guard in a public setting. It required extraordinary psychological control. Inside the pharmacy, Mercer approached the prescription counter, maintaining a grip on Tessa's elbow. The plainclothes agents noted that while controlling, his posture wasn't overtly threatening. To casual observers, they might have appeared as a couple where one partner was simply being possessive. The pharmacist, uninvolved in the operation, requested Mercer's ID and insurance information. This routine administrative moment became the pivotal opportunity Tessa had been waiting for. As Mercer released her arm to retrieve his wallet, she implemented the final phase of her strategy. "I'm going to look at the cold medicine," she told him, her voice casual. "My throat feels scratchy." This seemingly innocent statement was precisely calculated. It referenced her earlier complaints of not feeling well, maintaining consistency in her performance while creating a legitimate reason to move a short distance away. Most importantly, it presented no obvious reason for alarm. Mercer could still see her within the store. The undercover agents observed as Tessa moved deliberately toward the cold medication aisle, maintaining visibility to Mercer while gradually increasing the distance between them. At the end of the aisle stood a pharmacy technician restocking shelves, a young woman approximately Tessa's age. What happened next was captured by the pharmacy's security cameras and would later be described by Detective Shepard as the most controlled and strategic self-rescue I've witnessed in 20 years of law enforcement. Tessa selected a box of cold medicine and approached the pharmacy technician. Making eye contact, she spoke in a low, measured voice. "My name is Tessa Bellamy. I was abducted 13 days ago. The man at the counter is Darian Mercer. He's holding me against my will. Please call 911 quietly." The clarity and specificity of this statement, providing her full name, her captor's name, and the duration of her captivity, reflected Tessa's understanding that precise information would accelerate response. Moreover, her calm delivery prevented the kind of dramatic reaction that might alert Mercer. The pharmacy technician, initially confused, quickly grasped the gravity of the situation. She maintained her professional demeanor and nodded, then walked unhurriedly toward the back office. Mercer, still engaged with paperwork at the prescription counter, glanced toward Tessa but showed no immediate concern. The distance she had created was significant, but not suspicious, exactly as she had calculated. The undercover agent nearest to Tessa made subtle eye contact, a brief nod confirming that her message had been received and that help was present. However, the operation now faced a critical juncture: how to extract Tessa without triggering a violent response from Mercer. The pharmacy technician had indeed called 911, unaware that law enforcement was already on scene. This created a secondary challenge, as local police would soon respond to the location, potentially complicating the FBI's controlled intervention. Rivera made the tactical decision to accelerate the extraction. Using the pharmacy's layout to advantage, one agent positioned himself near the entrance while others moved to isolate Mercer from Tessa. At 2:31 p.m., the prescription clerk called Mercer's name, indicating his medication was ready. As he turned his attention to the counter, an agent approached Tessa and quietly identified himself, guiding her toward the rear exit. Simultaneously, other agents converged on Mercer's position. The moment when Mercer realized Tessa was no longer in his sightline was captured on security footage. His head snapped up, gaze darting across the pharmacy. The prescription package fell from his hand as he abruptly moved toward the cold medicine aisle where he had last seen her. "Federal agents," announced the nearest officer, displaying his badge. "Darian Mercer, you're under arrest." Mercer's response revealed the complete collapse of his psychological fantasy. He lunged toward the back of the store, shouting Tessa's name. Two agents intercepted him, while others secured the building's exits. By this point, Tessa had already been escorted through the pharmacy's rear service corridor to a secure vehicle. Her extraction had been completed without Mercer ever reaching her, the culmination of a psychological strategy that had systematically dismantled his control. The arrest itself was anticlimactic. Mercer, overwhelmed by the sudden disruption of his delusion, offered minimal physical resistance. As agents secured him, he repeatedly asked about Tessa, his questions reflecting the persistent fantasy that she shared a connection with him. Detective Shepard reached the secure vehicle where Tessa waited within minutes of her extraction. What struck him immediately was her composure. Not the stunned relief typical of rescued hostages, but the focused clarity of someone who had been an active participant in her own liberation. "Are my parents okay?" were her first words to Shepard. "They're fine," he assured her. "They never lost faith we'd find you." "I never lost faith either," Tessa replied. "But I wasn't going to wait for rescue if I could create an opportunity myself." The medical examination conducted at Elk Ridge Regional Hospital confirmed that while Tessa was dehydrated and had lost weight, she had not been physically assaulted. The psychological evaluation was equally remarkable. She displayed acute situational awareness and none of the disorientation common to prolonged captivity. She understood exactly what had happened to her, the examining psychologist noted. More importantly, she understood the psychological dynamics that had allowed her to manipulate her captor. She had maintained a clear mental boundary between the compliant persona she presented to Mercer and her authentic self. Diana and Nathan Bellamy were reunited with their daughter at the hospital 3 hours after her escape. The moment, captured by a security camera in the hospital corridor, showed Diana's professional composure finally breaking as she embraced Tessa. "You did everything right," Diana whispered. Everything. What investigators would come to realize in the days that followed was that Tessa Bellamy had accomplished something extraordinary. She had not simply survived her captivity, she had systematically analyzed her captor's psychology and developed a counter-strategy that ultimately led to her freedom. The search of the mountain cabin revealed just how meticulous Mercer's planning had been, and by extension, how remarkable Tessa's psychological victory was. The cabin contained elaborate security measures, including multiple locks, barred windows, and motion sensors on the approach road. Investigators discovered a hidden room containing surveillance equipment similar to that found in Mercer's apartment, suggesting his intention to resume monitoring Tessa's life had his fantasy of eventual consensual release ever materialized. Most disturbing were journals detailing his obsession, including plans extending months into the future. The writings revealed that Mercer had envisioned a progressively normalized relationship emerging from the captivity, a delusion that Tessa had recognized and strategically exploited to engineer her escape. As Darian Mercer was processed into the criminal justice system and Tessa Bellamy began her recovery, the case attracted attention from law enforcement agencies and psychological researchers alike. The successful application of psychological counter-manipulation by a victim represented a significant case study in hostage survival strategies. What no one yet realized was how Tessa's extraordinary experience would ultimately reshape approaches to hostage negotiation training and victim psychology, developments that would emerge during the final phase of the case, the pursuit of justice through the court system. The United States District Court for the Eastern District of Washington stood as a monument to judicial authority, a building of limestone and marble designed to inspire confidence in the rule of law. On January 17, 2012, nearly 10 months after Tessa Bellamy's abduction, this imposing structure became the stage for what legal observers would later describe as one of the most psychologically complex trials in the district's history. Federal prosecutor Madeleine Chen had built a methodical case against Darian Mercer. The charges were substantial: kidnapping, stalking, false imprisonment, and crossing state lines with intent to commit felony offenses. If convicted on all counts, Mercer faced a minimum of 25 years to life imprisonment. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Forensics had matched Tessa's DNA to samples found in Mercer's van and the mountain cabin. His electronic devices contained thousands of images of Tessa taken without her knowledge. The surveillance equipment, restraints, and extensive written plans discovered in both his apartment and the cabin established premeditation beyond any reasonable doubt. Yet Chen recognized that the most powerful evidence was Tessa herself. "This case isn't merely about the physical crime of abduction," Chen told Detective Shepard during trial preparation. "It's about psychological warfare, both Mercer's campaign against Tessa and her extraordinary counter-strategy." Mercer's defense attorney, court-appointed public defender Thomas Riley, faced an unenviable task. With overwhelming physical evidence and a client who had been apprehended in the act, traditional defenses were largely unavailable. Riley initially explored an insanity plea, arranging for psychiatric evaluations, but the results undermined this approach. "Mr. Mercer exhibits obsessive tendencies and delusional thinking patterns," the court-appointed psychiatrist concluded. However, he clearly understood the nature and wrongfulness of his actions. He took elaborate steps to avoid detection, demonstrating awareness that his behavior violated legal and social norms. With diminished capacity arguments proving untenable, Riley pivoted to a strategy that inadvertently highlighted the psychological sophistication of Tessa's escape. He suggested that the relationship had evolved into something consensual, that Tessa had willingly accompanied Mercer to the pharmacy without attempting to flee or signal distress. This defense strategy necessitated Tessa's testimony, placing her face-to-face with her captor for the first time since her escape. The courtroom on January 23rd was filled to capacity as Tessa Bellamy took the witness stand. At 20 years old, she presented a composed demeanor that belied the trauma she had experienced. Her testimony, delivered over 2 days, provided the jury with unprecedented insight into the psychological dynamics of captivity and survival. "I recognized early in my captivity that direct resistance would likely escalate violence," Tessa explained, her voice steady. "Based on my understanding of similar cases, I determined that psychological counter-manipulation offered the best chance for survival and eventual escape." Prosecutor Chen guided her through the details of her captivity and the calculated strategy she had developed. Tessa described her methodical observation of Mercer's patterns, her identification of his psychological vulnerabilities, and the gradual implementation of her plan to create the pharmacy opportunity. During cross-examination, defense attorney Riley attempted to suggest that Tessa's apparent cooperation indicated developing consent. Her response became one of the trial's defining moments. "Mr. Riley," she said, meeting his gaze directly, "I studied criminal psychology extensively before my abduction. I understood the concept of trauma bonding and Stockholm Syndrome. What Mr. Mercer interpreted as developing affection was a deliberate psychological technique I employed to create an escape opportunity. I maintained a clear mental distinction between my authentic self and the compliant persona I presented to him." When Riley pressed further, suggesting that her sophisticated manipulation indicated a lack of genuine fear, Tessa's response was measured but powerful. "Strategic thinking and terror are not mutually exclusive," she stated. "I was afraid every moment of those 13 days, but fear doesn't preclude tactical planning when your life depends on it." The defense's strategy backfired dramatically. Rather than establishing doubt about captivity conditions, Riley's questioning highlighted Tessa's extraordinary psychological resilience and the calculated nature of her escape plan, reinforcing the prosecution's narrative that Mercer's fantasy of developing consent existed entirely in his mind. Forensic psychologist Dr. Sophia Larson provided expert testimony contextualizing Tessa's approach. What Ms. Bellamy implemented is a sophisticated version of what we train hostage negotiators to recognize: the strategic establishment of rapport to create negotiation opportunities. The difference is that she applied these techniques from the position of captive rather than negotiator, which required exceptional psychological control. On January 30th, it was Darian Mercer's turn to testify. His appearance demonstrated the complete collapse of the carefully constructed identity he had presented to Tessa during her captivity. Gone was the controlled demeanor and articulate speech patterns. Instead, he appeared disheveled and frequently lost track of his responses. Most revealing was his persistent reference to his relationship with Tessa, despite months of incarceration and legal proceedings. Even when confronted with evidence of his elaborate stalking and abduction plans, Mercer maintained that he had been helping Tessa escape an ordinary life that failed to appreciate her special qualities. "She understood me," he insisted during cross-examination. "At the pharmacy, she could have run or screamed, but she didn't. She talked to me normally about cold medicine. That proves we had developed a real connection." Prosecutor Chen seized on this delusional interpretation. "Mr. Mercer, are you suggesting that Ms. Bellamy's request to look at cold medicine, which she used to create distance between you and approach a pharmacy employee for help, was evidence of affection rather than a calculated escape strategy?" His response revealed the depth of his persistent delusion. She was playing a role for the benefit of others. She knew we had to maintain appearances in public. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning unanimous guilty verdicts on all charges. On February 15, 2012, Judge Eleanor Martinez delivered the sentence: 30 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, followed by lifetime supervised release and registration as a sex offender. "Mr. Mercer," Judge Martinez stated during sentencing, "you constructed an elaborate fantasy around a young woman who never consented to any relationship with you. You violated her freedom, her security, and her right to determine her own associations. The methodical nature of your actions and your continued inability to recognize the criminal nature of your behavior necessitate the maximum sentence available under federal guidelines." For Tessa Bellamy and her family, the conviction and sentencing provided legal closure to an ordeal that had transformed their lives. In the months that followed, Tessa returned to her studies at Washington State University, where she shifted her academic focus to criminal psychology with an emphasis on victim advocacy. The case's implications extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Law enforcement agencies across the country incorporated aspects of Tessa's psychological counter-strategy into hostage survival training. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed a case study based on her experience, highlighting the potential for victims to actively participate in their own rescue through psychological techniques. Diana Bellamy collaborated with her daughter to publish a paper in the Journal of Traumatic Stress titled "Strategic Psychological Resistance in Captivity Scenarios," which became required reading in criminal psychology programs. Their work emphasized that while Tessa's approach had succeeded, it required specific psychological knowledge that most victims wouldn't possess, underscoring the need for expanded public education about captivity survival. 3 years after the trial, Tessa completed her undergraduate degree and accepted a position with the FBI's Victim Services Division, where she developed training programs for both law enforcement and the public. Her experience informed a new approach to understanding captivity psychology, one that recognized victims not merely as passive recipients of trauma, but as potential strategic actors in their own survival. "What happened to me was extraordinary," Tessa explained during a lecture at Quantico in 2015. "But the principles that allowed me to survive can be taught. Understanding the psychology of captivity from both the perpetrator's and victim's perspectives creates possibilities for resistance that traditional physical security training doesn't address." The case of Tessa Bellamy versus Darian Mercer ultimately redefined how law enforcement, psychology professionals, and the public understood the dynamics of abduction scenarios. It demonstrated that while predators like Mercer study their victims, those victims can sometimes turn the tables, using psychology not just as a field of study, but as a powerful tool for survival. For Detective Lowell Shepard, who retired from the Spokane Police Department in 2017, the Bellamy case remained the most remarkable of his career. In 30 years of law enforcement, I never saw a more clear-eyed assessment of danger or a more strategically executed escape, he noted at his retirement ceremony. Tessa Bellamy didn't just survive her abduction, she systematically dismantled her captor's control using nothing but her mind. It was psychological self-defense at its finest. As for Darian Mercer, psychiatric evaluations conducted during his incarceration revealed that he maintained his delusional belief system despite years of therapy. Even from within the federal correctional system, he attempted to send letters to Tessa, communications that were intercepted by prison authorities and added to his case file, ensuring his continued maximum security classification. The final word on the case appropriately belonged to Tessa herself, who concluded her Quantico lecture with an observation that encapsulated the profound lesson of her experience. The most dangerous weapon in any abduction situation isn't necessarily in the captor's hands. Sometimes it's in the captive's mind. My knowledge didn't prevent my abduction, but it ensured that Darian Mercer's carefully constructed fantasy was ultimately no match for my reality.